So I'd like to highlight for you in a few slides some of the key ideas from Greenblatt's essay Culture, which in many ways underpins the sort of theoretical ideas behind American literary studies today. So the big thing to understand about what Greenblatt's up to is that he is shifting culture from a list of things like art, history, language, etc., to a set of dynamics. And in this case, the dynamics that he wants to explore and I'd like us to highlight are mobility, constraint, and exchange. So this is what Greenblatt means by constraint. And I won't bore you by reading the definition. You can read it while I'm talking. Hopefully you've already read it in the piece. What I think he's saying here is that one way of understanding what literature is what it does. And literature explores what we cannot do in a culture. Sometimes literature perpetuates those constraints. Sometimes it undercuts them. And sometimes, this is the part that's going to drive you crazy, it can do both. So we want to think about literature as enforcing the cultural boundaries by the way it uses praise and blame. Who's rewarded in a text? Who's valorized in a text? Often, that is a way of communicating constraint to a reader. These are the ways of behaving that this culture negotiates, that this culture accepts. Of course, a text can also valorize and praise people who challenge cultural constraints. That's something we want to keep in mind. But in general, when a text is reflecting its cultural values and praising and blaming, it's communicating those values to you. In this sense, the idea of a text as an agent of cultural transmission is valuable, right? How do we communicate the rules of the game over time? So that idea of constraint can be a little daunting, but Greenblatt also introduces a notion of mobility. And what he's trying to say here in his discussion of mobility is that without change, a society stagnates. It can't survive. It can't grow. So all is not lost. Resistance is not futile. We can look for both what we cannot do in a culture and what we can do in a culture, and the ways that we can do things that can manipulate, change, or evolve within that culture. And so one of the questions we're going to be asking is, where do we see patterns of mobility here? Or where do we see traditional patterns of mobility that are changing and becoming patterns of constraint, and where former patterns of constraint becoming patterns of mobility? There's a lot of flux and give and take here that opens up some really interesting conversations for us as we think about texts. Now, for me, one of the most interesting ideas that we can pull from Greenblatt, because it calls our attention to certain moments in the text we're reading, is exchange. And there's a nice definition of exchange up on the screen here. And I would like us to think about how moments of exchange confront us with the dynamics of constraint and mobility in our culture and in a work of literature. So when we read texts like Glaspell's Jury of Our Peers, or James's Daisy Miller, Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and really every text we're going to read all semester, what are the key moments of cultural exchange? What is being negotiated or traded through the relationships, practices, and institutions described in that text? So we'll be coming back to this again and again as we look at the different texts in the class. Now, one of the things I really enjoy about this Greenblatt essay is that through this prism of mobility and constraint and exchange, Greenblatt constructs a really kind of cool definition of what literature is. And I have it up here on the screen. It's on page 230. And I want to point out some of the really cool language here. So there's this idea of a general symbolic economy that a culture has, that literary artists are adept at manipulating. And then he walks us through sort of the tools of the literary artist: resonant stories, effective imagery, and language. I really like that. Sorry about that typo in there. But language. So through all this, literary artists can manipulate this economy. So in a way, everything is operating at a symbolic level, and artists are moving around different cultural symbols and values to explore the dynamics in a culture, to explore desire, fear, aggression, and these fundamental human motives, and to understand, supplement, support, and sometimes disrupt or challenge the dynamics of the culture from which it emerges. So that this intimate link between a work of art, between its language and its culture, is a really cool part of Greenblatt's idea. And sometimes critics of historicist approaches, which are the dominant ways we read in American literature courses, say that critics like Greenblatt have abandoned language analysis. But actually, as you can see from this phrase, language analysis is at the heart of this kind of historicist reading, right? It's language through which we construct stories, imagery, character, etc. And language comes from within a culture, reflects that culture, and can change that culture. So language is at the heart of any analysis of literature that is interested in the relationship between literature and culture. So, as a final note, one way we can think about Greenblatt is what I'm going to refer to throughout the course as the Greenblatt Question. How do texts and authors use resonant stories, imagery, and language to accumulate, transform, represent, and communicate social energies and practices of constraint and mobility in America? We're going to especially want to explore this in the first half of the course, but I think this language is going to resonate throughout the semester. Thanks for your time. See you in Blackboard.